Well, Stalin is wildly popular in Russia. Soviet nostalgia is at an all-time high, especially since the special military operation. And many people in Russia like Stalin, and they don't see him as a communist, right? And when the 1929 stock market crash happened, and unemployment was massive. The Soviet Union was experiencing huge amounts of economic growth with the five-year plans, and so they were contrasting the rising socialist system with the dying Western system, and at that point they built an independent movement on that basis that had a very unique quality to it. Well, I don't think that Trotsky would have had the ability to hold the Soviet Union together. Many people have pointed out Stalin was from Georgia and from a rural village, and he understood the peoples of the Russian Empire. Trotsky, on the other hand, was from Kherson, but he spent most of his life in the West, and as a Jew who endured persecution, he had kind of contempt, especially for the Russian peasantry.
Welcome to History Experience.
Hey guys, for our show today, I'm excited to welcome Caleb Maupin. He is an author and journalist who has written many books such as The Trotsky and Neoconservatives, The Whole Story, Who Are the Houthis, What Are They Fighting For, and many more. Today, we will discuss his new book, Mystical Stalinism and the Struggle Against Revisionism in America. Thank you, Caleb, very much for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Would you like to introduce the book? Its title is broad and very captivating as it encompasses both communist, Russian, and American history.
Yeah, well, the title is Mystical Stalinism and the Struggle Against Revisionism in America. And I talk about the history of the Marxist movement and geopolitics and how larger spiritual and cultural trends were reflected in the arguments and divisions that went on, in particular with relationship to the Communist Party of the United States and how it developed and deteriorated.
Your book examines how the Stalinization of the Communist Party, which began in 1928, greatly affected the American Communist Party and contributed to its rise in popularity. Can you discuss this subject further?
Sure. Well, in 1928, you had this Sixth World Congress of the Communist International, and that's when Stalin solidified his leadership. There was the defeat of the Bukharinite right opposition, the Trotskyite left opposition, and the line of the Sixth World Congress was class against class, or the third period political line, in which the communists defined themselves by struggling in opposition to social democracy and viewing social democrats as the main danger. And if you look at 1928, that is a time when the Communist Party of the United States really changed its approach and its messaging style, no longer trying to position itself as being part of the left, but rather having the strategy of building a united front from below by recruiting people to their own organization in opposition to the Social Democrats. And their rhetorical style, their mass organizing efforts, the way they built the unemployment councils, all of that was a real shift. They no longer saw themselves as part of the left. They saw themselves as an independent movement aligned with the Soviet Union, and when the 1929 stock market crash happened and unemployment was massive, the Soviet Union was experiencing huge amounts of economic growth with the five-year plans, and so they were contrasting the rising socialist system with the dying Western system, and at that point they built an independent movement on that basis that had a very unique quality to it, which I link to Stalin's background as a mass organizer.
That's interesting. Many believe that Hitler's rise in Germany resulted from the Communist Party, ordered by Stalin, refusing to cooperate with the Social Democrats. Your book debunks this idea. Could you discuss that?
Yeah, that's a common claim made by Trotskyites and others that it was Hitler's rise to power was the fault of Stalin because the communists of Germany wouldn't form a united front. Well, you have to remember the Social Democrats had murdered Rosa Luxemburg, and they had been a big part of the German government since the founding of the Weimar Republic, and the the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party increasingly represented very different strata of German society. The Social Democrats ran the industrial unions, and there was mass unemployment in Germany, but those who were lucky enough to still be employed in the industries tended to be wanting to hold on to their position, and so not trying to rock the boat, not trying to go on strike too much, not trying to be too radical. Whereas the Communist Party increasingly over the course of the 1920s became the party of the desperately poor and unemployed. As they built the unemployed councils and led bread riots, and they really just represented two different strata of the population. And those strata didn't see things eye to eye, and they had a very different approach. And that the idea that they could have just, formed a united front to block Hitler, that just wasn't realistic. I think people in both parties wanted that to some degree or other. I think the Social Democrats wanted that. I think the Communists wanted that, and both sides offered it. But it just wasn't going to happen because these are organizations that had literally killed each other. I mean, there were Social Democratic police officers that killed communists. There were communist militias that actively fought against the Social Democratic police. They were two different groupings representing two different social strata. And there was a river of blood between them, and they were not going to just get over their differences and unite to block Hitler, and that just wasn't something that was realistic. And the idea that Stalin just prevented such a thing for his own personal gain is a real huge historical oversimplification that we get from people that are just kind of opportunistically looking to demonize Stalin as a person. They're not looking at the actual objective conditions. It couldn't have happened.
In your book, you call Leon Trotsky Stalin's main rival, a Western Marxist. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, Trotsky's position from the time that he was, organizing before the Russian Revolution, mostly living in exile, all the way up until his death, was that he felt that he wanted his movement and he wanted Marxism in general to be part of the Western current, the Western left. When the Bolsheviks formed a party of new type, 1912, he rejected that, and instead he formed the August Bloc, which was an attempt to be the radical wing of the Menshevik Party. And that after he broke with the Communist International, his followers carried out the French turn, where they joined the social democratic parties of the various countries. They joined the Socialist Party in America, they joined the Social Democrats in France and elsewhere, and that he always took the position that it was the correct thing to do was to be part of the Western Marxist movement, just to present yourself as the more radical interpretation of it. Whereas Stalin carried on the tradition from Lenin, which was they saw the Western Marxist movement as part of imperialism, and they wanted to build a completely different movement that was against imperialism. And, the Bolsheviks, they supported the Emir of Afghanistan, who was a conservative monarchist because he was fighting the British Empire. They supported the Egyptian merchants and their uprising against the British Empire, and that they supported anyone who would struggle against imperialism. And if someone is a socialist and they are still a supporter of the Western imperialist system, that doesn't matter, right? That the Western imperialist monopolies that are dominating the world are the enemy, and that Bolshevism and then later Stalin's movement was a movement to defeat the Western imperialist system and enable national liberation struggles in the colonized world to be victorious. And that was the purpose that it served. Whereas for Trotsky, he was still very much thinking in the kind of the way Marx had spoken before Leninism of, the Western worker, the factory worker versus the employer, and the struggle of the wage worker against the employer. The Western worker will rise up. And Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution was essentially he wanted the Soviet Union to just kind of serve as a base area to spread communism to the West where it really mattered, in his view, right? That he basically said that unless you have communism in the West, nothing matters. Whereas Stalin was saying you're not going to have communism in the West, so we're going to build a prosperous socialist society, socialism in one country. And that was a very different approach. And, Trotsky even baited Stalin for being what he called Asiatic, arguing that he was not sufficiently Western and that his views did not represent the kind of sophisticated intellectual Marxism of the West. Trotsky was a Western Marxist. Stalin was somebody from the Bolshevik movement who gave voice to very Eastern ways of thinking and the rise of the Eastern world against the West.
For a counterfactual, how do you think the Soviet Union and the communist movement in the United States would have evolved if Trotsky had become the leader of the Soviet Union instead of Stalin?
Well, I don't think that Trotsky would have had the ability to hold the Soviet Union together. Many people have pointed out Stalin was from Georgia and from a rural village. And he understood the peoples of the Russian Empire. Trotsky, on the other hand, was from Kherson, but he spent most of his life in the West. And as a Jew who endured persecution, he had kind of contempt, especially for the Russian peasantry, and he would not have understood how to hold the Soviet Union together. Lenin gave a lecture where he criticized Trotsky for thinking that you could use military methods among the population. And that it's clear that Trotsky did not have the same level of kind of love and connection with the peoples of the Russian Empire that Stalin had. And he viewed kind of the Russia as just kind of a useful vehicle to do what he really wanted to do, which was march communist revolution into the West. And I think on that basis, the Soviet Union wouldn't have stayed intact. I think that the population would have become more and more alienated, and I think there would have been a counter-revolution. Likewise, I don't think the Communist Party of the United States would have been able to become the effective vehicle that it was in the 1930s for leading the mass unemployment struggles and eventually building the CIO industrial unions if they'd have been led by Trotsky, because Trotsky didn't have a mass approach. Stalin was a mass organizer. The Bolsheviks had two publications prior to the Russian Revolution: Iskra, which was the theoretical journal, and then they had Pravda, which was the daily newspaper. Stalin was the editor of Pravda, which was the daily newspaper that was distributed to workers, that featured worker correspondence, very short articles. It served as kind of an agitational publication. Stalin was a mass organizer. Trotsky was a Western Marxist intellectual. And if you look at the way the Communist Party developed, and you look at the way the Soviet Union developed, Stalin was able to do these things. Trotsky wouldn't have been able to do so.
Never saw it that way. How did Stalin's death and Khrushchev's denunciation of him in 1956 affect the American communist movement?
The American communist movement was devastated. They had been heavily persecuted by McCarthyism, but there was about 10,000 people, maybe 17,000 people, according to some estimates, that stayed loyal to the party, even though you would lose your job, even though the leaders of the party were put in prison. It was the Communist Party was very heavily persecuted in the 1950s. But then in 1956, when the Communist Party of the United States was starting to gradually come back into legal existence, with an office that opened up and all of that, for them to then embrace Khrushchev's secret speech, many people quit on the spot. They lost 2/3 of their membership in 1956 and 1957. People were devastated. There's rumors that are not confirmed of people committing suicide. The way Khrushchev spoke, to have the leader of the Soviet Union repeat the lies about Stalin and say that everything that they'd been denying for so many years and everything that the ruling class had been saying about the Soviet Union was true, that was too much. It was devastating. And Khrushchev did it for his own gain, as kind of a gesture to the West to try and, open up negotiations. And he did it for factional reasons. He was battling against Molotov, and Molotov, was somebody who had a different approach, but it had a devastating role in terms of American communism. The Communist Party of the United States has never recovered. They've never been a significant entity since then. There was a brief uptick in membership during the 1970s, the early 1970s, but not really. They kind of lost their ability to be a mass organization because of that demoralizing blow of Khrushchev's secret speech.
At the end of the book, you discuss how Stalin is seen in current-day Russia. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, Stalin is wildly popular in Russia. Soviet nostalgia is at an all-time high, especially since the special military operation. And many people in Russia like Stalin, and they don't see him as a communist, right? Lenin is quite unpopular. The Communist Party likes Lenin, and they support him. And but most Russian nationalists and people that are supporters of the current Russian government don't view Lenin in a positive light. They view him as someone who gave up a lot of territory at Brest-Litovsk. They look at all the chaos and instability that happened during the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, as well as the persecution of the Russian Orthodox Church. But Stalin is viewed differently, and Stalin is viewed almost like a great czar who unified the territories, drove out the invaders, made Russia a strong power once again, and kind of gave voice to the concept of a great Russia that is in a lot of Russian Orthodox theology, the idea that these lands that make up Russia are spiritually bonded to each other. And that is particularly fascinating. And you read War and Peace by Tolstoy. There's a lot of talk about the attachment that the peasantry in particular have to their land, and how when Napoleon invaded, the peasants defended their land because they had this spiritual connection to it. that Stalin kind of gave voice to these sentiments and was a representative. And then you get into modern geopolitics. Alexander Dugin and a lot of theorists in modern Russia and in China talk about civilizations of the land and civilizations of the sea. Thalassocracy is empires of the sea, and tellerocracy, empires of the land, and how Stalin and later Mao Zedong represented tellerocracy, kind of the civilization of the land repelling the empires of the sea and bringing vast territories together on the basis of a joint mission of collective development. And that empires of the sea, they have a big military and they control the trade routes, but empires of the land connect the land by building roads, and that there is kind of more of a focus on unified development on empires of the land, whereas empires of the sea simply focus on militarism and controlling trade routes. And, you can compare this also to what Henry Charles Carey wrote about the English system versus the American system, and civilization upon the land, and what was written in the early period of the United States about, how we wanted to be as a country. Would we be like the British Empire or not? There's a lot written about this, and that if you can fit Stalin and his defeat of Trotsky and the movement that Stalin built around the world, which had a huge impact on U.S. society in terms of building a movement against racism, building industrial unions. You can see Stalin as representing a different current. That there was Marxism that was kind of Western and globalist oriented. Karl Marx supported free trade, but then there was this kind of Eastern collectivism that gave voice and arose from Stalin, and it had a different spiritual quality.
In 2015, you had the opportunity to see the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei. Could you describe your experience of what that was like?
It was a deeply moving experience for me. I was in an auditorium with about 20,000 people, and these were the people of Iran that were the biggest supporters of the Islamic Revolution. I saw a lot of teenagers, young kids in military uniforms. I saw a lot of working class people who looked to Khamenei as their savior, as the one who fought for them. And I was in the auditorium. I remember at one point they started chanting "Death to America," and that was deeply moving to be the only American in an auditorium with 20,000 people chanting "Death to America." And it was a deeply emotional experience, but I understood that Khamenei was giving voice to the people of Iran in their struggle against imperialism. And he was not a Marxist, right? He very much rejected Marxism and was coming at things from a traditional Islamic perspective, but it was the same kind of thing that we've seen with various Marxist revolutions, right? It was the people of a country rejecting the domination of imperialism. And I was in that auditorium and I saw it with my own eyes.
Thank you. Where would you recommend readers to get your book and find more about your work in general?
Well, my website is calebmaupinbooks.net. I also run an organization called the Center for Political Innovation, cpiusa.org. And my book is available wherever books are sold. You just have to give them the name and the author and the ISBN. It has universal distribution. It's on Amazon, but it's available anywhere books are sold. It has, it should be any book distribution company should be able to carry it.
There we are. Caleb, thank you very much for joining us today, and I wish you continued success in your work.
It was a pleasure.